Test. There we go. Now we're working. Thank you. Okay. So that's working. Um all right, first thank you for coming. So this is just gonna be like a really short one, I think. There's not too much I think I'm going to cover today, but sort of the idea behind this is just to look at uh some cases and some news articles and maybe some things in popular culture like movies or shows and see sort of just do a sort of not too deep of a dive but maybe more of a surface level understanding of what sort of the legal principles at play are and what the interesting bits about them can be and trying to sort of foment a more practical and uh, proper understanding of what's going on in terms of each thing that's being presented. And um, I think the easiest way to do that is to look at what the legal philosophy behind everything is. Like when we have a rule being applied, why is the court ruling in that way, and what can we learn from that going forward, and maybe perhaps even try to predict where things might go. I think um I'm I think so. My background is that I'm a law student. I'm a first year, so I obviously don't have a lot of experience and um knowledge so far, but that's okay. I think part of learning is making mistakes and learning from them. And, as time goes on, I'll get better at this. And I think uh, some of the things that can be said are not always overly complicated. Like some things are fairly straightforward and some things are a bit more um, tough to dissect. Um, so yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. Uh, I'm not. I have. Let's. So my background is that um, I graduated undergrad with a double major in philosophy and political science. My main focuses during studying those was in philosophy was ethics and political philosophy, and then as part of my political science degree, my main focuses were legal philosophy and political philosophy. Um, so I have a lot of background in sort of understanding how governments are set up and work and meant to work, and sort of the ethics side of it. Most of my reading and my sort of uh, academic work was in Kant. So I think that's probably where I have the most familiarity with, but obviously I've read a lot of different philosophers, so I know more than just Kant. But in terms of legal background, mainly in business law. I have a decent amount of constitutional law background, um, and I think I will do my best to try to understand and break down legal principles from other areas. Like I think some clear ones that are, uh, you know, harder but still important are international law and things like that. But I think the main thing is just to kind of get into it and try to find some where things go. I think today will be more of a kind of test run and see how things play out. But um, yeah, so I think to start out, the first thing I wanted to do was look at some. I had some things um, saved and ready to go. So I have a few articles and I'm gonna go through this one probably a little more in depth and then try to understand and what these are looking like. So um, I think most of today will be looking at constitutional law since it's kind of the main thing and under stress right now, and I'm gonna do my best to try to not get into the political side of everything. I think it's important to just try to stay on the legal topics as best as I can, and as I think that's the most important thing, is just understanding what are the legal uh, elements at play, what are the options, and what are the things that might go forward and be relevant in terms of future um, um, ideas of how these principles can be applied, and maybe if they'll stand up against the sort of challenges that are occurring at the moment. So I think the first thing I want to do is just do a really quick overview of the US government, because understanding constitutional law is kind of difficult if you don't really understand the interplay of the government. So I think the first thing is just the federal government has three main branches. You have the judicial branch, you have the executive branch, and then you have the legislative branch. And so the main guiding principles behind each of these is that the executive branch enforces laws, legislative branch makes or creates laws, and then the judicial branch, which is where we are situated as lawyers and as legal experts, and is to interpret the laws. Interpret the laws, and also, more importantly, and most importantly for the Supreme Court, is interpret the Constitution. Interpret the Constitution. So I think when we look at how these three play together, is we have branches being laws being made, them being enforced, and when there's challenges, legal challenges to the laws, then the judicial branch gets involved. So this is the federal government. Oops. This is the federal government. And then, so this is set up and governed by the Constitution primarily. Obviously, Congress, the legislative branch is Congress. They make laws that also govern how the federal government operates, but sort of the way the Constitution is set up is that anything not explicitly outlined as being part of the federal government is then state governments, the individual states government's responsibility. So we often see things like education being under state governments, things like state roads being under their control and under their laws. The main point of interest judicially is that federal courts. Wow, that was really ugly. Hold on. Federal courts, they govern federal law. Federal courts, federal law. So when we have a dispute between states, for example, a federal court will be involved. So we have, like, say, Illinois and Indiana, for some reason, have a dispute over where the border line is, then a federal court will get involved, obviously. Not something that's probably going to happen in the near future, who knows, but it's not really something of interest to a state court, because if you put it in a Illinois state court, Illinois state court has a incentive to favor the Illinois government over the Indiana government. So to create some impartiality, we have federal courts get involved. In terms of why the judicial branch is important, I think the determination of laws being constitutional or not is kind of structurally and in terms of checks and balances vital to how the government functions. I think next time I can prepare some Supreme Court cases that are important, foundational to how the Supreme Court operates. I think the Supreme Court is like the top court, but we have a few cases where they dictate that they have the responsibility through the Constitution to review laws as being constitutional or not, and then sort of below the constitutionality question is also whether or not laws are legal and can be, or whether actions taken by the government are legal, whether actions taken by individuals or companies are legal. So then we have state courts, and we have federal courts above that, even though I've written it below it, federal courts below that, to both handle those disputes and kind of create an important tree going up of how things work. So very quickly we have federal courts. So these are things like the circuit court, the district courts, the circuit courts, appeals courts, and then we have state courts below that, but separate. And state courts are, the state Supreme Court, and then there's that same federal structure sort of below the state Supreme Court of appeals courts and district courts, circuit courts. Fine. So, like this structure just lends itself to how we deal with disputes, and how they go up the chain of courts until they reach a state Supreme Court for state for non-interstate disputes. The structure of how federal courts get involved in disputes, mainly civil, or not mainly civil, but in terms of civil disputes, is clearly outlined, and it's a bit more complicated, so we're not going to get into that, but we just need to know that there's federal courts and then there's state courts, and federal courts handle federal law disputes, state courts handle state law disputes, but federal courts can handle state law disputes. It's just circumstantial depending on when they get involved. So with that in mind, let's turn then to hold on, our first article, which is about the White House failing to comply with which is a federal court mandate order. So federal courts, they do these things. They're called orders, and they hear things from either the prosecution or the defense, and then they rule on those things. So let's just quickly read through this, and then we'll have just take a quick look at what's going on here with why this is an issue and what the legal issues involved in it are. Okay, so a federal judge said on Monday that the White House has defied his order to release billions of dollars in federal grants, marking the first time a judge has expressly declared that the Trump administration is disobeying a judicial mandate. So this is basically just the court order. The ruling by court administration officials is to comply with what the judge calls the plain text of the ruling. Clear and yeah. So we have the Trump administration lawyers appealing the judge's initial order, which was to give some quick context, to unfreeze federal funds that were meant to be used towards funding federally mandated programs. So what happened was Congress itself passed a law dictating that federal funds were to be used in a certain manner, and so then as we go back to our quick thing, we have the legislative branch making the law, and then the executive branch then has the responsibility to enforce that law. So the legislative branch said funds need to go to a certain place, and then they hand it off to the executive branch, which is the presidency, and the presidency then has control over making sure those funds get to where they're supposed to go. And that's just the separation of powers to ensure that there's no and checks and balances, so that there's no misuse of the law, and how Congress's power is meant to be separate. So we have them appealing. We have White House spokesperson saying that their actions are lawful, and a legal challenge it is a will. That's obviously political speech. Step judicial branches. Okay, so we have Vice President J.D. Vance saying that judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. This is, let's say, a misleading statement. Again, like we said, the judicial branch has the power to interpret laws, and so when we're talking about what the executive branch's power is, it's outlined in the Constitution. It's outlined through a history of Supreme Court rulings. Sometimes it's outlined through congressional laws, and the acts say what the executive branch can do and cannot do in terms of enforcing or how they're supposed to enforce laws. It's a bit complicated in terms of when the legislative branch can do that, but again, the Supreme Court is the ultimate determination of those, and not only the Supreme Court, but any federal court can determine what the executive branch's powers are. So yeah, it's misleading in that the executive branch's legitimate power is something that the court determines, and if the court determines that they're going to grant a restraining order, or they're going to mandate that the administration do certain things in terms of releasing and unfreezing funds, then that is their correct use of their power as the judicial branch of the government. We're gonna skip past some of this. The Article 2 powers. So Article 2 of the Constitution delineates what the executive branch's power is. We can get into that some other time. I don't think it's worth doing right now because it's a bit complicated in terms of how Article 2 has evolved through Supreme Court decisions over the years. But yeah. This is some stuff from the California Attorney General. More nonsense, so we don't need to get into. Okay, so here we have what the judges did. So we have that the judges made a preliminary ruling that the two executive actions, the funding freeze and other orders, may violate existing statutes. So we have basically just that the judge issued an order. A preliminary ruling is just them looking at the law, looking at what the two parties are saying is being done, and quickly making a ruling based on that in order to avoid unnecessary delays in terms of certain things. Like a funding freeze can be potentially disastrous if it's not properly handled. So the judge wanted to make sure that, this funding freeze wouldn't stay in place for very long to ensure that the funds could be released and be used properly, according to their ruling. So, yeah, here's where things get a bit complicated and a bit interesting, is how the Trump administration responds to the ruling by the judge. This is so this is where we have here in terms of we have a judge issuing an order for certain actions to be taken by the defendants, in this case the Office of Personnel Management, and after and then what happens is that in the judge's order they outline what needs to be done, and how it needs to be done is usually up to the party unless the judge specifies. So here we have that the judge is ordering the FDA to restore their web pages identified by the plaintiff. And then here on the next page, we have the opinion of the judge explaining their reasoning. So we have the legal background that they're using, the rules, the laws that they're referencing. Yeah. That's just what the thing is. So the DFA is the party here asking for the judge to make certain things happen, and they're asserting that they're likely to succeed. That's for the judge to decide, and the judge seems to believe them in terms of offering an initial order that's saying, we think that the plaintiff has a good case to make for restoring the things, and until the defendants can prove that they have the legal right to take down those pages, statutes meaning laws, the judge seems to disagree. So here we have something important, which is that it's very rare for a president not to comply with an order from a judge. And so I think, what is the things that happen when an order is not complied with? So you have a judge's order. So the judge issues this order, and it's saying to the president, President, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And then the president says, or doesn't necessarily have to say, but they just do not comply. They not complying with the order, right? So then the next step is one of two things can happen. The plaintiffs can go to the judge and say that the defendants, in this case it's president's staff or perhaps the president himself is not complying with the order, at which point the court will issue another order saying that it's not being complied with and that they have until a certain date to comply with the order, or maybe they think that the defendants are not operating in good faith, at which point they can hold the defendants in contempt of court. In terms of how that works, there's two options. There's civil contempt and criminal contempt. So civil contempt comes very basically comes with civil penalties, monetary, they might have some fines or something. And then a criminal contempt normally is jail time, and it could also carry with it civil penalties. And in terms of which option the court goes with is up to the discretion of the judge. Normally they start with civil penalties, but in certain cases where maybe they think that it's unlikely, or they want to set a precedent that not complying with their orders is something that they really don't want, then they might go straight to criminal contempt proceedings. So what does this mean in terms of the presidency itself? Well, so if the president doesn't comply with a court order, there's probably a couple things that might happen. Usually the president, in this case, Trump. Oh, that's really messed up. In this case, Trump, he's not the one, physically doing these things. It's usually some people within certain departments. So Trump himself, by a Supreme Court decision last year, 2024, I believe it was, Trump himself is he's immune from criminal criminal prosecution for actions that he takes, and this is the important part, that are part of that are for presidential duties. Let's say that presidential duties. So this is the important part. He's criminally immune from prosecution for actions that he takes, which are designated as part of his presidential duties. This only applies to the president themselves. So when you have a court issuing a order and saying that their orders are not being complied with, it's normally towards some lower part of the executive branch, let's say, you know, a department head, for example. So the head of the FDA maybe, oops, would have to comply with the court order, and if the department head in this case doesn't, then they can be held criminally liable for contempt of court because they are not the president and they are not immune from criminal prosecution. While this is necessarily something that may force compliance with the court order, there is sort of a bit of a loophole in that since this is a federal crime, contempt of a federal court is a federal crime, then the president can issue a pardon to the person, in this case, in this example, the head of the FDA, and then that federal crime is gone. So, well, it's not gone, but they're admit guilt depending on how the pardon is issued, and then they don't face the punishment for their criminal actions. So while that's unlikely, I don't think necessarily we are likely to see this sort of scenario pop up. It's likely that that would be quite disastrous in terms of a separation of powers and respect for the branches of government. It's something that could happen. It's an option available to the executive branch, in which case the only way to hold the presidency liable would be through impeachment by the legislative branch. So we have really only one sort of surefire method of holding the president himself responsible for his actions, but there's sort of we can't really go through a carousel of pardons, of contempt of court and then pardon and then contempt of court pardon. Eventually I think we run into an issue of people below Trump and the seat of presidency being willing and unwilling to actually defy a court order, which is again something that hasn't happened very often in the past. So I think that's basically what we have there, is just what are the sort of steps that we take as the judicial branch can take in terms of failure to comply with a court order. It's this stuff. It's contempt of court, and then it's a civil contempt or criminal contempt, and then we have civil penalties, which can be reversed if they eventually comply, or we have criminal penalties which don't get reversed even if they do comply, and we have sort of this issue of the president himself being criminally immune, but everyone below him not being criminally immune. So we have more likelihood that they're going to comply with the orders that are being issued. So I think that's kind of where that falls. I brought this up. I had this saved just to try to kind of have an example of what a court order looks like, what a court opinion on that order looks like, and then finally we have sort of a court mandated status report from the TRO, the temporary restraining order that was issued by the court on the actions of, in this case, the defendant. There was a issuance of a TRO, and that's sort of what this is. So, I think next time we can maybe go through this a little more in depth and try to understand what the legal reasonings that the court uses in finding that the issuance of its temporary restraining order to be lawful. And probably they find that it's in line with previous actions of previous courts and previous cases, and it's quite a long document, so they clearly are being thorough in terms of what their reasoning for for their actions. And I think it's, we have here a district judge for a district court, and I think it's important to understand that. Now I had saved this just to try to understand it's a bit rambly, what Elon's going through here. But I think there's some legal principles we can pull out and try to understand quickly. Okay, so let's just quickly stop there and then understand what he's saying and kind of quick highlight something that he clearly omits, which is we live in the United States, we live in a republic, which means that we vote and we elect officials that represent our values, and we vote on towards those officials to be representative of what we hope for and what we want to be vote for, because I think it would be, and the framers of the Constitution foresaw this, that it would be unwieldy and largely impossible to have every citizen in the country vote on every single thing as a true democracy would have. So we have a republic, which is a representative democracy. And here he mentions the ability of the elected officials, those being the office of the president and by extension, the president's appointment of executive branch officials, and then the congressional officials themselves, representatives of the people in the Senate and the House. I think one thing that he importantly omits is that the Supreme Court and the judicial branch itself is also part of the government. It's also an important part of the checks and balances on the executive and legislative branches, as I showed before, that the three branches of government work in tandem, and it's not incorrect to have the courts themselves issue and decide on whether or not actions taken by the legislative or executive branches are in line with the Constitution. The Constitution is an important document. It's quite old, but it's important in terms of maintaining the republic and the democracy that we live in. And I think something that he seems to forget also is that many many judges are elected. Federal judges are appointed by the office of the president and confirmed by the Senate. These are important things to remind ourselves of, that by having the office of the president and the Senate themselves put forward and confirm federal judges, they are, by extension of being a republic, judges are people that are appointed by the people. They're extensions of, by having elected representatives vote and confirm and put in place federal judges, they are elected officials in a similar fashion to the office of the president and congressional representatives as well. I don't know what this. Just skip. Yeah, we're just gonna skip some of the things which he doesn't understand. Yeah, he keeps. Yeah, so there's just a lot of rambling here. So I think the important part is to understand that federal bureaucracy, as he keeps mentioning, is something that is the government. So it doesn't seem to make sense very much what he's trying to get at there, that the bureaucracy is something bad, which, again, trying to stay on the legal principles, but yeah, I think, oops. It's just, it's easy to get bogged down in terms of why some certain things are happening. in the minutia of the things that are being said, but it's important to remember that we have these systems in place because they're the things that have worked for many, many years, and they're important because they're part of the Constitution. When we have federal funds, which are we have federal funds which are delineated by Congress, which is doing so through an act of Congress, a law, and then those funds are being sent to states, or they're being sent to certain aid foundations, or something, or maybe it's a private company that needs to do some government work. We have those funds which are being importantly set out by Congress. It's not up to the executive branch to determine whether or not those funds are being appropriately sent or appropriately used. That's Congress has decided that through an act, and then the president's or the executive branch in this case only job is to ensure that those funds are getting to where they're supposed to be going, and being done, and being sent out, and being safely, and that they're being used properly. And so that's not real. Their job is not to second guess Congress, because Congress creates a law and then they send it to the president, who signs it into law. So we have two branches of government working in tandem to determine what the law is, what we need to use it for, and how it's important. And I think that may seem straightforward, and it might seem obvious that we have two branches of government working together, and it's not Congress acting by itself in terms of, and abusing its power, and it's not that the judiciary is abusing its power by holding the executive responsible and to account for their actions that are clearly not in line with the powers of the executive branch that are outlined in Article 2. So yeah, I think that's really just the main points. I think that is kind of a good place to stop. It's a lot to take in, and it's a lot of stuff to understand in terms of how these things work, and why they work in the ways they do, and why it's important that they work the way that they do. If you're new, which most of you are, because it's my first time doing this, thanks for watching. Please, there's a link to the Discord in the below my stream window in the out section. You can join it and offer some court cases or some news articles that involve law that that you would want me to go over in the next stream. I'm gonna set up another forum in the Discord to make sure that if there's any corrections or if things I need to address from a previous stream in the next stream, that people can put that in the forum and make sure that I can see it, so I can issue a correction if it's necessary in the next stream of something that I said. And sometimes it's hard finding articles and that are not a lot of political speech and kind of focus on the legal principles. So if you have things to recommend, please do that. I know today was a little haphazard, but I'm just trying to get used to this. format and understand what I think works and what doesn't work. And I think over time I'll get better at this. And um, it's hard. It's hard to explain some things that are the legal side of it without getting into the political side. So it's something that requires practice, and I'm doing my best. So um, if you enjoyed it, please come join again next Sunday. I'll try to find some new articles and some maybe uh, do something a little more interesting than just constitutional law, because there's obviously lots of different parts of the law and the legal system, not just government and constitution. But I think, given the current landscape of the U.S. government and sort of the constitutional issues currently being challenged and addressed, that it was important to start here today. Yeah, so if you enjoy it, come back next Sunday, join the Discord, and I also plan to start playing playing some games maybe this coming week if I have time. Again, I am a law student, so I do have responsibilities, and if you do subscribe or donate, and I appreciate it, and it helps me go towards funding my education, so which will help me